cooperation from the projector, but that seemed to be in business. So we were discussing expectancies. Expectancies were part of the learning, kind of an outcome of learning, or an outcome of your interactions with the world. In a way, it's learning about like a meta regularity in the world. By that I mean it's an expectation about how efficacious you are in the world. That is, how good are you? How effective are you at making things come to pass? Right? So this is a concept that was championed by a guy who I think I mentioned last time, who was here at UConn. I see what's going on. Oopsie. Named Jules Roeder. He was at Ohio State first, and then he came here for a while, until his death some years ago. So this doesn't have to necessarily be based on direct experience. It could be based on your experiences with other people. It could be based on all sorts of things. So in putting it back into the kind of learning framework, they want to add this additional layer so that if you have an expectation about a behavior producing a consequence, not an experience of it, not the actual operant conditioning kind of experience, but just that you think it's going to work, you're more likely to do it. Right? And you can imagine what Skinner thought of this. He like lost his mind. Like, think you're going to do it. No, there's no thinking. There's stimulus, there's response, and there's consequences. That's it. Okay? So, but this guy's following Tolman from last time said, well, actually, maybe not. Maybe you can learn other things in other ways. Okay? So we talked about last time about self-fulfilling prophecies kind of work this way. You have expectancies that can change behavior, that can drive learning. All right, that seems pretty clear. Roeder kind of boiled this all down into a concept that he considered really important, and that actually moved out of the cognitive social learning literature into more social psychology and personality psychology, called locus of control, and I'll just mention it here. If you take a personality social psychology course, you'll hear about locus of control in a lot more detail than this. But generally, it's an interesting idea, and it relates to learning again because you're learning this kind of meta regularity in the world. That is, the world can be affected by you to some degree. Okay? So in broad strokes, there are kind of two poles to this. One is to have an internal locus of control, which essentially means that you are controlling what's happening in the world. You're controlling your own fate in a way. You are in charge, you make it go. Okay, so that's one sort of canonical way to be. The other is to have an external locus of control, by which that you kind of, you've come to believe that the world just rolls along and you're doing what you can, but mostly what happens to you is just an outcome of that world. It doesn't have to do with you and what you're trying to do. So this is one of those moments where, you know, you don't want to have like medical school syndrome. You're like, oh my God, that's me. Okay. You probably aren't at either one of these loci, right? You're probably somewhere in the middle like everybody else. But those are the kind of the two pole positions. Okay, so here are examples of internal and external locus of control items that one might endorse on one of these surveys. Okay, so you would have a survey and you would say, from 1 to 10, I more strongly believe that promotions are earned through hard work and persistence. Oh man, that's absolutely right. As opposed to making a lot of money is largely a matter of getting the right breaks. Right? So internal, external. There's usually a direct connection between how hard I study and the grades I get. It's really up to the teachers what grade. It's all just random. Can't really tell us much. Right? Yeah. Internal and external. So that's this idea, again, that you can have different degrees to which you feel like you're in charge or the world is in charge. Being on the far side of external locus of control tends to be associated with negative outcomes in life, right? Because you kind of stop trying. So back to learning theory. So for the learning theorists, this was like on that, right? They were the hardcore behaviors. Hated this. But it also seemed to pick up some things in psychology that people liked. And so it became this extension of learning theory. About the same time, this fellow, Albert Bandura, was starting to put together something that he called social learning theory. And this is kind of the natural consequence of that early work by Tolman rolling along and letting in cognition, letting in the idea that what you think matters, right? So you can think about the rotor expectancy theory that way. It's about suddenly like what you're thinking, what you expect of the world is playing, not just what happens in the world. So Bandura noted this obvious fact, I suppose, about the human condition, that for humans, there isn't an individual human ever. You don't learn as an isolated, away from others person. You're always embedded in a social context, right from birth all the way through, right? No one is like out there on the moon living out by themselves, as far as we know, right? So that's not happening. So what's happening is that you are in a social milieu all the time. And so evolution probably is taking advantage of that. And your learning system, call it something, probably takes advantage of it too. So people learn from observing others as well as from experience, right? It's not that you can't learn from experience. If you kick something too hard, oh, that hurts, I won't do that again. Sure. But a lot of what you learn is from others, and we're sophisticated, so we can actually learn through observation. Okay? He called this modeling. You can learn through observing others. He also eventually said you can learn by observing yourself. Okay, so at some point, gets a little bit confusing. The initial work in this, you'll see, is going to be very, very old. I mean, you just won't believe what this person is wearing. But anyway, it's like, it goes way, way back. But he proposed that models, to be powerful for an individual learning, usually children, should have attributes like this. You should see them as someone in some authority position. They should be attractive. They should be likable. They should have prestige. So to be a model that is someone who you'd like to learn from, they should have these characteristics. So this is his very, very famous Bobo doll experiment. This poor person, this is probably like on his tombstone. Right? Here lies Albert Bandura, Bobo doll guy. It happens to people sometimes. They do this one thing and it just sticks. So the Bobo doll, for him, it stuck. He was interested early in his career in aggression and how we got differences in aggression amongst people, particularly children. Right? So children being aggressive is generally not a good thing. We don't want children to be aggressive. And we really don't want people to be too aggressive either, although sometimes a little aggression can go a long way. But what he found with the Bobo doll experiment ran against the current thinking terms of aggression. So aggression in Bandura's time when he was doing this work was supposed to be a cathartic thing. It builds up in you very Freudian, right? It's like, I'm frustrated, I'm feeling like I need to release the aggression. So the idea is that it's somehow suppressed by the system, and that the release of the aggression makes you feel better. So what he showed was that by having a child watch an aggressive model, what actually, yes, fulfills most of those good model qualities, he could get the child to aggress or not, if the model was not being aggressive, towards this neutral thing, which is the Bobo doll.
Model tumbled the doll with the model, flung it in the air. Threw it down. Widely believed that seeing other than aggression would drain high. As you can see, exposure to aggressive modeling is highly retired. Exposure to aggressive modeling increased attraction to guns, even though it was never modeled. Guns had less appeal to children who had no exposure to aggressive modeling. The children also picked up the novel hostile language.
All right, you get the general idea. You can see it's really old timey, and in today's world, I'm not sure that really even qualifies as aggression behavior anymore, right? That's the model was actually pretty mild, but it worked, and boy, people were very interested in this because they were able to show just by, there was no like prescription for the child to do what the model did, but just seeing it was enough to make it happen. Again, the probabilities of aggression. So that was troubling, and that it kind of generalized into things that were not demonstrated, like suddenly having interest in guns or using verbal language that was aggressive, right? So that's all kind of fed this idea that maybe social learning through modeling is really important. So according to Bandura, there are environmental factors, personal factors, and behavior that all are interacting with each other during the social learning process. So by environmental factors, he means, well, first off, things like having the models, but also you can learn through instruction, which for him is like a different form of modeling. You can learn through feedback, that is people telling you not to do that or do something in a different way. But also there are effects of context. So unlike the behaviorists, right, who brought us all this learning stuff, this is going to be very hard to get your hands on, right? Things like instruction. Now I have to worry about the quality of the instruction and your understanding of it, and all the cognitive factors that go into that. When your behavior is moving towards the sort of behavior that you're trying to model, this tends to increase your feelings of efficacy, and that supports learning, all this progression. And of course, there's a feeling of being motivated to do something that's necessary, and that kind of supports your doing this, right? So if you are working on a problem or trying to accomplish something, right, this feeling of, well, I'm approaching the end of this, I'm mastering this, right? These are motivating factors. And finally, there are all sorts of personal factors, like having some overarching goals and desires, right? So this class is very difficult for me, but I want to be a doctor, so I'm going to continue to take organic chemistry. And then there are things like expectancies and efficacy. So these are like the Jules-Roeder expectancies we just talked about. And then there are all sorts of attributions that people make. So the number of different factors now that are going to be involved in learning are many, many, many. All right. It's not just what the environment provides when I do this behavior. And so for the people in learning theory, the original behaviorists, they're like, oh my God, what have you done? You've taken our beautiful theory and you've injected all this stuff that's going to be incredibly hard to measure, and that we're just not sure how it plays out. What are we going to do? Well, these guys weren't worried. They said, don't worry, this is all going to work out, you'll see. And we are still riding on the you'll see part in psychology. It's become cognitive psychology, and social psychology is kind of a variant of cognitive psychology now. So we'll get there in just a moment. So, little recap on learning. We had behaviorism, this emphasis entirely on overt behavior. That's all that you could measure. I don't care what your expectations are. I don't care what your thought process is. I don't care what your motivation is. I have the environment. I'm going to measure it. I have your behavior. I'm going to measure that too. I'm reinforcing behaviors using consequences. Again, things from the environment. And then there are going to be these stimulus from the environment to response from you, relationships. That's all there is. Those are all the things in my theory. And I'm going to write laws about behavior from those. They did write some laws, and it's not too bad, but it doesn't include everything. And that's why we ended up with social learning theory stepping in and being like, oh, hold on. What about other people? That would be great. And I think the behaviors could have been okay with that if it had been cast in a different way. But it seemed to, at least to Bandura and others like him, to require things like cognition and interaction being put into the system in a way that was not going to neatly end up as stimulus response behavior, right? So that's the social learning theory. And at the same time, maybe in parallel, but we're kind of going to use it as our next jumping off point, this cognitive approach came to the line where from Tolman we knew that learning is not necessarily all going to be overt behavior. It could be done just as you're wandering around a maze. Right, so learning can occur offline in that sort of sense. It doesn't have to be evident in your behaviors. And then drawing from social learning theory, there will be all sorts of cognitive components you'll see which are just going to multiply and multiply as we try to tell a story about human behavior that will include learning, but will include many, many other things. So that's where we end up with cognitive psychology. And the modern day world is all about cognitive psychology. Maybe cognitive psychology meets neuroscience, might be another way to say it. But there are lots and lots of factors in there. Exploring those factors seems like a big task, maybe too big. So this brings us to this modern day approach, which is largely grounded in the idea of cognition. So that is that you have some kind of system internal to you that operates on stored information in your mind, in your brain, maybe. It's unclear exactly where it's going to be. And that information has been put there by some process and resides there pretty stably, but not perfectly stably. And that lack of perfect stability gives us this idea of memory. And usually we think about memory as being like, well, did I get milk like I was supposed to at the store? Or what is that phone number anyway? Right? But these guys, because they're talking about the contents of your mind as being so important, they have, for better or worse, shifted memory into the absolute forefront of the theory. So everything that isn't currently in your sensory experience and that you're operating on has to be registered somehow in memory. So memory becomes this huge thing. And it has to be available for you to do most things. Everything you know, even things that are just assumptions about the world, have to be in memory somehow. So memory is now not just like a little weird backwater in psychology, or like people who study lists of words. It's like the big thing. So we're going to start that one. So a couple of theoretical issues. One thing that people in memory want to know is, how is it organized? They assume, again, that you have information stored somehow in your mind. They want to know both how that works biologically, like what could it be to have a memory? Kind of an interesting idea. What would it be? I mean, connections amongst neurons seems to be the idea, right? How would that be a memory? We don't know, but we don't really have any other choices. So it seems like it has to be somewhere in there. But then we also want to know in a more, here I'm saying conceptually, but a more kind of abstract way, what does it mean to have memories be organized? So it turns out that your memory system is wonderfully organized, although it's not easily understood, its organization. But it's very clear that it's not just like a jumble of discrete things that are been kind of pasted together. Somehow it's very nicely set up, and you're able to maneuver in it very well. Okay, so people want to know, how could that occur, and what is that like? They also would like to know, are there different, they'll call representational systems for different things? So for example, you certainly can close your eyes and have the experience, some sort of sensory replay experience that sometimes is called the theater of the mind, or excuse me, movie in the mind, right? So you close your eyes, you're like, okay, I can picture my bedroom, yep, and I can turn to my right, yep, there's more of my bed, right? You can do this, right? So that's one kind of memory, and it seems like sensory recreation or something. Right? Harder to do for other senses, maybe. Vision's pretty easy to do for, right? But it's hard to do for things like touch. Like what's, like picking up a baseball bat. What does that feel like? Yeah, maybe you get something, but it's not as wonderfully clear as the visual version of it. So why is that? We also clearly have verbal information, some of which just straight up I can remember what words are and what they mean. But I also have like a rich understanding of words that doesn't seem to relate like in a one-to-one way to experience. So a good example is the word liberty. Right? Liberty isn't really an experience, and yet we all understand what it means. I can't say, oh yeah, I remember liberty. Not really. Right? There's a Liberty Bar in San Antonio, but that's not what we mean. Right? We mean like this. We need like an abstract concept to talk about liberty, right? Which we all know what it is, and somehow that's got to be in memory too. And then even stranger is that we seem to have all these things that are like controlling our body that we also want to have in memory. So there are things that you can do that are in motor memory. Sometimes we call these things motor programs. So you're very skilled, for example, at tying your shoes, right? You can go and the shoes are tied, right? But that's something you learned, obviously. You're skilled at many other things. Putting on your pants, right? All you need is an injury to show you, like, oh, hold it. Huh. Back doesn't bend that way anymore. Putting on the pants, not so easy. Putting on your socks, easy when you're young, not so easy when you're old. You got to change your motor programs. possible, but it's not easy. So somehow these things are also supposed to be in memory, but clearly that memory doesn't seem to have anything to do with my ability to recollect my bedroom or my office or something, right? So we have all these different, from this perspective, memory systems that are being populated all the time and maybe are in interaction with each other. A final question, and one that I think is kind of most practical and least interesting, is how do we control memory? So there's this idea, it's kind of a funny idea if you think about it, is that we have control over memory, right? You can go and search for things. You can even, it's an odd phenomenon, but you can know when you're almost to a memory, right? Like, oh yeah, just right on the tip of my tongue. What is that actor's name? And yeah, I almost got it. What is that? How do you know that you're almost there? Who's controlling the memory if not you, the memories? All very strange. So this idea that you could improve your memory, people in education, people working with those of us who are getting older, right, would like to improve our memory, right? That's, well, actually, we're all getting older. Those of us who are already gotten old, I guess. Right, so are there ways to improve the control? Okay, you'll see. We're not going to talk about that too much. So, what is this weirdo thing that cognitive psychology is trying to sell? Well, it's memory is going to be the acquisition, storage, and retrieval of all things knowable, right? Information, what we might call knowledge, procedures, and somehow we're going to tag those, just like you might in a computer, right? Where you address things for later use. So it's one thing to store it, it's another to be able to find it when you need it. And one thing to know something, it's another to be able to get to the thing. So that's going to be memory. Acquisition, storage, and retrieval. All those things for memory system. And we're going to have all the stuff that I've just been talking about, from motor programs, the concepts, the somehow visual recollections, all stored there waiting for you to use them as needed. So this brings us to the information processing approach, which is, again, the sort of all the rage in the 80s, 90s, still really is holding sway completely, but people call it other things now. The analogy, obviously, since with these images, is to a computer. The idea is that your mind is like a computer, particularly your memory systems are like a computer, and they have the same properties that a computer has when somebody tries to put information on it. So there is a process that interfaces with the world, takes that information and puts it into the right codes for that memory system, called encoding. And so you have keystrokes on a computer, particular things happen, particular physical changes happen, which then record those key presses in some memory place. Right? They're not the actual key presses. They're just somehow correspondences with the key presses. Those get stored. So we can represent storage as a hard drive, but in computers, and we're going to kind of argue in humans as well, there are many different types of storage. But the hard drive does a nice job, right? Because things are written down and then they're there for a while. They're stable for a little bit. And then there's retrieval. Here meant to be depicted as a display. So I've stored some stuff and now I'm able to display it back. And the consequence is supposed to be that I've somehow gone back to storage and said, oh, you know that thing I put there? Give me that thing, right? And then whatever that is, words, concepts, it comes back out to be presented to somebody. But this is part of the problem with the theory, is the somebody isn't so clear. The somebody is you, but then you're also the person with the memory and the story. See what I mean? So it's a little bit funny. Who exactly gets it? But anyway, that's the idea. It comes back out somehow. It's in consciousness there. That'll solve it. It's called consciousness. Okay. So that's the idea. And this information processing approach is super powerful in good ways and bad ways. So let's go back a little bit further. We'll come back to information processing and kind of unpack it very in just a slide or two. But we have to start with Ebbinghaus. It's in my contract. I actually have to talk about Ebbinghaus. Ebbinghaus is one of the original memory scientists. This guy was a dedicated nut. I mean, he really was into this. He used himself as his own subject to study memory. Okay, so very out there. So what he did in his he did a bunch of things, but most famously what he did is he memorized nonsense syllables through repeated exposure. Okay. So he would memorize them, allow himself to forget, and then memorize them again, and allow himself to forget. Okay. Memorize them again, so on and so forth. Okay. And he's really testing how many repetitions through the nonsense syllables it took until they were committed to memory, until they could get them back out at 100%. Okay, so things like Hajj, Kaf, Ral, right? So he would have a long list of these things, set number, and then his job was to recall them all. Eventually, you get to 100%, then he would give himself a break for a while, then you do it again. Lots of them. So why would he use nonsense syllables? He had found that by using non-nonsense syllables originally, small words, his memory was all over the place, right? Because they have the semantic connection to things, right? So boat, well, I know about boats. I can remember boats. I've been in boats before, fell out of a boat once. So, there's all this stuff that goes with boat. Cat, well, I have a cat. Oh, so that's really easy to remember because I think of my cat when you say cat, right? So those sort of connections support memory, and it was messing up his results. So this stuff, generally speaking, is less related, maybe even unrelated to anything you know. It doesn't, they don't have intrinsic meaning. So that cleaned things up for him a little bit. So there are a couple of testing methods that he invented. One is serial recall, and the other is free recall. Oh. Yeah. So serial recall is recalling things in order. Okay. Free recall is recalling things any old which way. And so if you're doing serial recall, you got to have the first thing out first, the second thing that you were presented out second, the third thing you were presented out third, and so on and so forth. Free recall, just blast it all out there, whatever you got. Okay, so that's two methods that he invented and are with us to this day. He also invented this idea of recognition memory, which is a little bit different in that you're just asking people if you give them the item back. So let's say he memorized some stuff and then he pulls at random one of these things or not. Okay, and then says, is this one of the things you remembered for this list? You with me? So recognizing that this was in the set, essentially. And most famously, he invented this idea of savings. So up here, let me start down here, in the denominator, this is how many cycles it took to get that first memorization. Okay, so let's say he has a list of 10 words, and he has to pass through that list 5 times in order to get 100%. That's the first memorization for cycles. Some time elapses. Now he's going to do that same set again, okay? And he re-memorizes it. But this time, it only takes 3 cycles. So he has an improvement that is represented by that percentage 3/5. And he calls that savings from that first memorization, even though, right, this seemed like this was more or less gone. Okay, but it turns out it's gone, and you can see that in the relearning attempt. And that's what savings is telling us. All right, so that's a little bit of Ebbinghaus. We'll do just a tiny bit more because these are things you'll hear about. So learning curves and forgetting curves, we've already talked a little about learning curves. So your performance in learning, generally speaking, improves with the number of repetitions. So this is a typical learning curve. So this could be effort, could be time down here. This could be skill, it could be knowledge, could be percent correct on a memory test, right? And so this, how fast you acquire, the steepness of this, right, is a good indicator of how fast you're learning. We also have on the other side of the equation, sort of, and this is now we're back to Ebbinghaus, a forgetting curve. So if you learn something and we ask what percentage you're retaining over time, this is what forgetting can look like depending on the condition. So your immediate recall is 100%, let's say. Maybe he's even done this, he's learned it 2 criteria, so it's 100%. So this one's kind of guaranteed. After 20 minutes, maybe it's down to 60%. After an hour and a little bit, it's down to it's 45 or something like that, 44, right? And then after a day, after 2 days, 6 days, you can see this is quite a loggy kind of scale, right? Up to a month later, right? Way out here. And now you're kind of settling down where this is, you can always remember a little bit of it. Okay, so this is the sort of stuff that you produce. So this is a forgetting curve. When he does the relearning stuff, it looks like this. So here, now this scale is in days. This is the first attempt at learning it. And you can see this is pretty steep here. This forgetting is pretty steep, okay, over that first day. The end of that first day, he reviews it again. So he gets it back up to 100%. And now it's a little bit subtle, but I think you can see it. The forgetting rate is more shallow. 2 days later, he does it again. More shallow yet, and so on and so forth. Right? So there's something about learning, then forgetting, relearning, and then forgetting that results in this savings we talked about. Okay, so learning curves, forgetting curves, and the phenomenon of relearning something, right, which gives you savings. In more modern times, people have used various and sundry tasks to try to figure out what's going on in memory. One of the driving results from these kind of tasks is this thing called the serial position effect. So it's done like this. It's a free recall task. Recall in any order you want. So here are some words. Done with simple words like this. It can be done with nonsense syllables too. So chair, box, cat, spoon, ear, king, ring, hammer, frame, pin, phone, wing. Right? They would be given to you. Boom, boom, boom. Disappear. Maybe you'd be given an intervening task. Maybe you wouldn't. Usually you just are allowed to wait. And then you're asked to recall in any order that you want. So simple. The weird thing that happens is that if you look, at the original position of the words in the sequence. Okay, forget about primacy and recency for 1 second. The probability of the early words, okay, so literally like chair would be here, box would be there, cat would be there. You see what I mean? So just lining them up all the way across. Okay. The early words have a high likelihood of recall. And the late words have a high likelihood of recall. And the ones in the middle, which I'm calling intermediate here, have the lowest likelihood. And that seemed weird. Right? It seemed like a couple things that could happen, right? But it should be like the late ones or the early ones are retrieved from memory better because of whatever process it is works better early or late, right? And you could tell either story, but that both are true is kind of a strange deal. And this effect seemed to require that we have two systems in order to explain. At least that's what the cognitive psychologists think. So they want to explain, after many, all the experiments. I couldn't tell you about all the experiments because they've spent a lot of time at this. They decided, given all the evidence, that there are two things going on here. The primacy effect is due to more repetitions. And so the words at the beginning of the sequence more likely to be recalled. That is the primacy effect itself. And the explanation is supposed to be greater repetition. And the recency effect, which at the end of the sequence are more likely to be recalled, that's supposed to be due to less decay. So the repetition angle, the reason, so what they're suggesting is that what happens is you go chair, box, cat, spoon, ear, king, ring, hammer, frame, pin, phone, wing. And immediately, if you're committed to trying to do this, you start repeating those over and over again. Okay, you keep them in what we're going to call short-term memory, and you go over and over and over. And so you go, right off the bat, you go chair, box, cat, spoon, ring. So that's how it goes. And as you're doing that, get a little bit ahead of myself, those things are slowly fading away from memory, like settling into dust. Okay. And every time you go through, you like bring them back up. Well, the ones that you've gone through the most are the ones at the beginning. The ones that you go through the least are the ones at the end, because even as you're hearing the list for that first time, you're starting to do the repeat. So the greater repetition actually kind of moves them into a second memory system, which is long-term, as opposed to these guys who are most likely to be there just by virtue of the fact that they were here most recently. So they're going to get the least decay. So this effect is going to be like from short-term memory. And this effect is about the transition into long-term memory, which we'll come back to in a moment, because that is kind of the standard model. So this is what's called the modal model, or the standard model of human memory. And it assumes that we have three memory stores. The first one, and the least studied, it's a little sad, is the sensory register. So when you get new information from your sensory system, their idea is that there's a little memory buffer that holds that information just for a little bit of time. You can't really do much in there, and you're not much aware of it. It feels like you're in direct contact with the world. They want to say the sensory register is sort of what you're in direct contact with. If so events out in the world get into sensory register. If you choose to put your attention on something in the sensory register, you can move it into short-term memory. Right, so you can go, oh, I'm going to put my attention on those words. That's what I'm supposed to be doing. So I put my attention on the words and I move those into short-term memory. Short-term memory holds a small amount of information and will just say it right out loud in consciousness. People will argue about this and be horrified that I said consciousness, but that's actually what they really mean. Right? And you're aware of the contents of your short-term memory. Much like when you hear somebody's name for the first time, you meet them, you're like, oh, yes, huh. And the person says their name and you go, okay, I got it. Right now, I'm aware of your name. But then conversation happens or something, you get distracted. Damn, I lost it. Right? And it slipped from consciousness. Maybe it's still in memory, maybe it's not, but it's not in your consciousness anymore. So being held in consciousness, that's part of short-term memory. We'll have more to say about that in a bit. So you move, this can last between 20 or 30 seconds, depending on what you're doing with it. It has this limited capacity. You can only remember, it turns out, 5 to 9 items. And that's why numbers that we tend to use on a regular basis are rarely longer than that. So short-term memory is this place where it's in memory, but you are experiencing it through your memory in a way. There is a second encoding process that allows you to move information from short-term memory into long-term memory. Long-term memory is this amazing thing where you can hold huge amounts of information for very, very long amounts of time. In fact, nobody thinks there's really a time limit per se, although you do forget things. So I can explain why people think that happens, but it's not supposed to just like fade away on its own. Unlike short-term memory, which if you don't keep upping short-term memory, you don't keep hitting those notes, keep ringing those bells, everything just fades away. All right, I've got to let you go there. Have a lovely weekend. See you next time.